Good evening. My name is Diana Munn, and I am Director of Public Programs at the Harvard Museums of Science and Culture. I am delighted to welcome you to tonight's lecture sponsored by the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East. It is now my pleasure to introduce Peter Dermanwelian, Barbara Bell Professor of Egyptology at Harvard University and Director of the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East, who will introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Diana, and welcome to everyone joining us from all over the world and too many time zones for me to keep track of. I'd like to give a special shout out to the Harvard Egyptology grad students currently spread out in the US and Japan, Italy, and Spain. And I apologize that we can't take our speaker out to dinner after the lecture as we usually do, but perhaps we can entice her back physically in better times. I might also mention about the museum situation on the campus. The Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East, while you can't visit it, is actually open virtually. So go on to the HMain website, hmain.harvard.edu, and you can click on a special virtual tour where you can see all of our galleries on all 3 floors, complete with additional embedded hotspots with videos, additional text, even rotating animated 3D models. So do enjoy that. And a special secret, there may be more museums coming on the Harvard campus. Dr. Willeke Wendrich received her PhD from Leiden University in 1999 and now holds the Joan Silsbee Chair in African Cultural Archaeology. And she's also professor of Egyptian Archaeology and Digital Humanities in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at UCLA. She's worked for 30 years in Egypt and currently directs an archaeological project in Ethiopia with a strong focus on ethno-archaeology and community archaeology. From 2012 to 2016, she was the director of the Center for Digital Humanities, and now she's director of the Cotsen Institute of Archaeology at UCLA. She's also the editor-in-chief of the online UCLA Encyclopedia of Egyptology, board member of the Institute for Field Research, and academic board member of the Egyptian Museum in Turin. She's published widely on the social context of craft production, and especially on basketry and basket makers. Her publications include Egyptian Archaeology in 2010, that's a textbook that we've used in class here for many years, Archaeology and Apprenticeship in 2012, and the Desert Fayum Reinvestigated in 2017. Since 2019, she's the president of the International Association of Egyptologists. So we are extremely lucky to have persuaded her to take time out from her very busy schedule to join us for a talk on apprenticeship in ancient Egypt. Dr. Willeke Wendrich.
Thank you, Peter. It is a delight to be here with you. As you see in my background, there's a basketry sieve, which is currently in the museum in Cairo, a photograph by Nick Brown, one of the graduate students at UCLA. Allow me to share my screen. So when we read about ancient Egypt, very often you hear people say, if you look at the countryside in Egypt, you can just see that nothing ever changes. You look at, for instance, this farmer who is creating mud bricks, and you compare that to the tomb of Rechmiré, and you see people there collecting mud and creating mud bricks in a similar fashion, using a mold, very much as we saw in the example from nowadays. This way of reasoning is used even stronger when we talk about ancient Egypt. Egypt is described as this non-changing society. And the most often cited example is the smiting scene. Here's the label of Den, around 2900 BCE, before the Common Era. And then we jump to 1219 BCE, Ramses II. And then the Roman emperors use smiting scenes. Now, using this as an example of an unchangeable society seems problematic because we are talking about thousands of years of history. And if we think of the history of the United States and how different that was 500 years ago, how many changes wouldn't we expect in thousands of years? So I want to talk a little bit about continuity and change. How are we understanding that tension field? How are we using continuity and change? Do we emphasize the continuity or do we emphasize the change? Because as in the examples I just gave, you can see both in those. You can really focus on the continuity, or you can say, well, yeah, but those smiting scenes, they had all different tools and the context was different. So the meaning was very, very different. Another question, of course, is how can we explain that there is continuity or that there is change? And what it made me think about is how did continuity persist, but also how was change affected and how did that relate to knowledge transmission? And that is where I got interested in apprenticeship. Because if we talk about continuity, then that is something that has to be passed on from generation to generation. And also, if we talk about change, that is something that breaks through that chain of transmission, or maybe is an integral part of the chain of transmission. So that's what we're going to talk about a little today. And I start in 1921 with Petry's corpus of prehistoric pottery. He published this, it's the very famous sequence dating, the only way that Petry had in the early 20th century to date his sites by comparing the types of pottery that occurred and how the ratio between different types of pottery changed over time. So it's a form of relative dating that he used before we had carbon-14 dating available. This particular pot was found in 1928, and it's one of the earliest pots or pottery types found in Egypt. Fayum pottery is a little older, but not very nice to look at, so I'm not starting there. This is beautiful hand-formed vessel. It's around 30 centimeters high, found in 1928, so not part of Petry's sequence yet. But this dates to around 4,500 to 4,000 BCE from the Badarian culture. And Petry went on and compared all the different pottery types. And I just show a couple of examples because to look at it on a page is very different than to look at the pots themselves. Most of these are from the British Museum. So this Nagada 1 from Hugh, black-topped pottery, and that comes in different shapes. From roughly the same period is also this pot, which has this beautiful painted white lines, strongly burnished pot. Then we have burnished pottery with figures in white lines. Again, a little bit later, this one from El Mahasna. Pottery that is dated to the Nagada 2 period. This one's also from Hugh. These beautiful spirals actually symbolize or represent stone vessels. And you can see that because of the little lug handles to the side. That's typically the way that handles were made in stone vessels. And here we have a copy in pottery. This too is from that period, Nagada 1C to Nagada 2A. These bag-shaped vessels. Most of the vessels I'll show here are about 26 to 30 centimeters in height. As is this one, burnished, red burnished pot. And the so-called W series of Petry, the wavy handles series, you can see why they're called that. And we know that these wavy handles developed from actual handles into just a line of decoration, and then they appeared completely. So also these kind of changes were brought in by potters over time. And then Nagada 2, this beautifully painted pottery with a wavy handle and a lug handle. So it references stone vessels but it also references decoration that you find in other media as well. Boats, ostriches, and dancers, human figures. Nagada 2. Then we have these dotted painted pots, also imitating stoneware from Nagada 3. So archaeologists use change. Change is extremely important for this dating. And why then do we use change but don't think about how change came about and how change related to education, to apprenticeship? Nagada 3A2, here the wavy handle is just this decorative line, and those lines painted on top of the pot are actually a representation of a carrying net. So let's look a little bit into what potters actually do and what kind of variation of pots they make and how that relates to trade, to demand, but also to creativity and to how people produce things and how they learn to produce things. So this is a potter from Fayum, from El Nazla. Actually, this one is from Komashim. It's the same group of potters, but they work in two different areas. It is a technique that you find in many areas in Africa, the so-called pedal and anvil technique. So he has a hollow in the ground and he stomps out clay in that hollow to form these globular pots. So you see these globular pots in the background, and in the foreground the zeer, or the water vessel. They're in this case both unfired yet. The zeer is made on a wheel, and the globular pots, as I said, are this pedal and anvil technique. Now this is a salesman from Fayum with a complete array of vessels that he sells at the side of the road. And the clientele for these pots are a little bit different than the pots that you can buy directly at Nazla, because those globular pots are water pots. They evaporate water, so they stay cool. The zeers are water pots. They also make cooking pots at Nazla. They really make the daily use pots. What you see here on sale are more decorative pots made in Fayum city, large vessels that are used in gardens as decoration. So here, there's different types of demand. There's the demand for the standardized ware, the cooking pots, the water pots, and then there's a market for decorative ware. Now, a bit ironic is that the pot that he holds up proudly is not from Fayum at all. That's a very famous pot from Middle Egypt, from Der Balas, also a water vessel. So we see that change comes in because of demand, but change comes also in, as I said, through creativity and through changes in the apprenticeship. And there's different ways of learning, of course. And there was in ancient Egypt as well. There's the formal apprenticeship, a school or an apprenticeship agreement. Now we know for schools for scribes, in a sense, the house of life in the temple was dedicated to scribes, including teaching scribes. We don't really have apprenticeship agreements from ancient Egypt. We do have them from ancient Greece, quite a number of them. We, of course, have them from the Middle Ages, from Europe, where a parent and a craftsman agree to send a child to the craftsman to be apprenticed. Often the parents either pay for this or they pay for housing and food for the student, and the student works in the workshop of the craftsperson. The informal apprenticeship usually goes along family relationships. Someone is born to the trade, so to speak. You work with your father, with your uncle, with your mother, with your aunt, and you learn the trade almost like playing. Yet, of course, scribes also apprentice themselves. They sit, as it were, at the feet of the master. This little statuette is from Amarna, and we see a scribe sitting at the feet of the god Thoth as the master scribe. And of course, as a scribe, there's not theoretical knowledge only that you learn, but you also learn the craft of writing and papyrus preparation and what have you. Now, I want to look closely at Nazla and at apprenticeship there. As an apprentice, you don't only learn from your direct master or your father or your uncle. You're part of a community of practice. Practitioners also learn from each other. They form this community, and the community in itself stands out because of the way they do things. They might have secrets, they might have trade secrets, they might have recipes, they might have a special way of firing. So all that knowledge and all that skill is transferred from one generation to the next in those communities of practice. And learning a craft is not the way we learn something for a hobby. I've never learned how to make pots. I did learn how to make baskets, but I wouldn't call myself a basket maker. And someone who just did a pottery class probably wouldn't call themselves a potter, because there's a lot more involved than that. There are steps. There are steps in learning a craft. You start with observation and imitation. And then in a lot of apprenticeship, you then step into assistant. You assist a craftsman. And then it's a matter of practice and practice and practice. Now, nowadays, as a non-professional, we do observation and imitation. We look at a lot of YouTube videos. At least I do. And then I practice. This whole step of assistance, I really don't do. But then again, I'm not a professional in these fields, because an apprenticeship usually takes at least 7 years, often double that time. In Fayum, as a pupil, you assist for 7 years. And then 7 years, you are an apprentice. You're allowed to produce things, but you're not a potter yet. So there's 14 years of hard work before you can call yourself a potter in Fayum. So let's look a little bit on how these different steps work. Observation and imitation is something that's almost automatic. Children sit at their mother's side. Boys run around in the workshop. And we know, everybody who has children knows that they like to do exactly as mom does or as daddy does. So that also works in craftsmanship. Children play, they imitate what their parents do. And while playing, they get involved in the craft a little bit. Often it's not very formal, these first steps. The assistance is something that's much more serious. Nowadays, a lot of the assisting happens after school hours because children have to go to school. In the past, those assistantships were often full-time. For instance, we have this depiction from TT38, where we see an assistant running after the scribe. He's not allowed to carry the real signs of the trade. The scribe is the one who carries the scribal palette, which is not just a tool of the trade, it's also a sign of the craft. We have plenty of depictions of children being involved in the work of adults, especially in the so-called daily life scenes that we find in tombs. For instance, here we see this naked boy bending over, filling in a basket. This is another example of the tomb of Menna, where you see the boy reaping everything that the men have left. We don't know how old these children are, but they might be really small. They might be 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds running around and pretending to be part of the whole procedure. And then when they grow up a little bit, their tasks become heavier, more important, a bit more effort, a bit more responsibility. And then the time of practice starts. You need to do it time and again. And in the beginning, your results are lousy. If you make a pot, the potter might look at it and just throw it back into the clay heap. So good try, try again. We see the different tasks in this image in the tomb of Amenhotep from Beni Hassan. It seems that we have 5 women here. The women with the top parts of their dresses, they are involved in weaving, and it seems in spinning or preparation. Then there's an older woman standing, she's overseeing. And then we have a young girl who doesn't wear a top, and she's involved in spinning. So that's one of those things of assistance, one of those parts where they start learning. Actually, she's not spinning, she's twine, she's plying. She's putting 2 strands together. It's a task that is leading up to learning how to spin. And also nowadays, we see young girls learning the craft from people in the village. In this case, these are the hands of a girl who's around 11 years old, and she's learning how to make a basket from her neighbor. In her case, her mother doesn't do this, so she learns from her neighbor. And she just does this time and again in order to train herself to become a proficient basket maker. We also have so-called practice pieces. But what is actually the work of an apprentice? How can we tell whether this is an apprentice doing this? Because we also have professionals trying their hand at things. So here we have 2 owls, we have 2 faces. They're a bit different in proportion. And you can imagine that the one to the right on the ostracon was sketched by a master draftsman, and the one on the left with a slightly longer nose, a slightly different curve to the eyebrow, may have been done by an apprentice. But it's a pretty good job. This one is from Aphrodisias in Turkey, a practice piece. How do we know it's a practice piece? Well, there's not a lot of statues that have 2 left feet, so it's pretty clear. The one on the left foot on the left, is beautifully executed. The one on the right is just being hacked out of a block of stone. So maybe this was an exam. You just get a left foot and a piece of stone, and here you go. You make another left foot. It's less well executed in detail, and it's still a little bit rough. Or you have this one. A little bit of a clunky way of writing your hieroglyphs and doing your cartouches. But as Karakuni remarked in an article in this book, The Archaeology of Apprenticeship, does bad quality necessarily equal apprenticeship? No, it doesn't. Sometimes you just have bad quality producers. In this case, it is apprenticeship, however, because the other side of the ostracon has the example. And you do see that's the hand of the master rather than the hand of the pupil. And then these 2 examples from Berlin, or now in the museum in Berlin. Is this a matter of an example and an apprentice trying his hand? Most Egyptologists think that this is not the case, because of course you also need sketches. You need to figure out what you're going to draw. You need to figure out how you're going to position something. So in this case, it's quite likely that this is a first sketch and a refinement. And we know from the tombs that things were set out first in red, then corrected in black, and then finally hacked out in relief or painted. What you learn during apprenticeship are dexterity, skill, and not importantly, endurance. So how do we define these? Dexterity, that's making the right motions, doing the right motions, the right movements. Skill is doing the right motions in the right order, know what you need to do at which point. Endurance is being able to repeat those motions for lengthy periods, because Most crafts procedures take a long time. They consist of a lot of repetitive actions. They need muscle strength. They need a trained body to be able to keep up those motions for a long period. So let's look at some examples of apprenticeship in ceramics. We said observation, imitation, assistance, and practice for at least 7 years, sometimes double that. And that's not unique to present-day Egypt. There's a very interesting research project by Hélène Wallard, who looked at potters in New Mexico, in the USA, and in Cameroon, in the Wayo community. And she looked at the apprenticeship of these people. In both cases, women. These are the potteries from New Mexico, from San Ildefonso, beautifully decorated, burnished black pottery. And this requires 5 to 7 days of apprenticeship to be able to do this. Now, the interesting thing that Hélène Wallard found was not just that women trained for 5 to 7 years, depending on how talented they were. So even if you're highly talented, it will still take you years to go through the steps of the apprenticeship. What she found was that when a woman got married and moved to another village, she might be a master potter in her own village, but she needed to start from scratch in the new village. She needed to train with her mother-in-law as an apprentice potter, start all over again with the same steps. She might go through them a lot faster because she is a master potter after all, but she needed to go through the apprenticeship again. The same is true in Cameroon. The Wayo Potter's Apprenticeship lasts for 7 years, divided in elements of 2 years, 2 years, 2 years, 1 year, and then a quick succession of the last steps. The first 2 years, just being an assistant. You collect clay, you fetch water, you fetch wood, and nobody explains anything to you. You're completely ignored. It's a test. Do you really want to become a potter? Do you have what it takes? The only thing they'll tell you is that some things are taboo. Some days you can't collect some things. You can't put it there, you have to put it here. So you are getting slowly involved in the community of practice, but you're not learning something in any formal way, shape, or form. Then you're allowed to make miniature pots of the entire corpus, and that is characterized as your birth. In that period, you just observe. You look at what the older potters do, and you imitate it in small forms. But you're not even allowed to ask questions, let alone that anyone explains anything to you. 2 years of that. And then finally, you're allowed to make full-size pots. You're not allowed to decorate them, but at least you can make the pots. In Egypt, present-day Egypt, the equivalent is that you start with collecting clay. You can empty out the kiln. You're not allowed to fill the kiln because that's specialized work. You're not allowed to make pots. At some point, you're allowed to make the handles of the pots. You're allowed to clean the pots, but it takes a long time before you're actually allowed to make the pottery. In the Wayo Potter's Apprenticeship, finally, when you are, after these 4 years of introduction, finally allowed to make full-size pots, then you get the explanation. But the interesting thing is that if you make a mistake or if you're clumsy, that is not considered as you being clumsy. It is you being considered disorderly. It goes against the social order. So it's much more than just being able to make a pot. It's all about being part of the community. Then finally, in year 7, you're allowed to decorate. And then becomes this period of repetition. And you have had your explanations, you know what the taboos are, you will be corrected when needed, but basically you just get on with it. You have to just now do it and get it ingrained, get this body knowledge ingrained in your body. And when you're there, even though you're maybe not perfect yet because you need this practice, you're allowed to fire the pots, you're allowed to do post-fireman treatments, and that will last for a number of weeks when you really focus on that. And then you are introduced into the blacksmith community. Blacksmith and potters are together, one community. There's a ceremony, and then you're a full-grown potter, which means that you're also engaged to be married. Engaged to be married in another village. And when you move to that village, you start all over again. You train with your mother-in-law, because you need to be enculturated in that different society, in that different community of practice. So apart from dexterity, skill, and endurance, there's more to learn. And that is why it takes 7 years. You need the knowledge, you need the recipes, the processes, you need to know the temperatures and how to judge those. But most importantly, you need to be enculturated. You need to have the right attitude. You have to know what the traditions are. You have to show respect for the traditions. That is why it takes 7 years. Now, those different phases from the apprenticeship are linked to different phases of the production process. And there, the idea of chaîne opératoire becomes very important. It's a term keyed by André Leroy-Gourand, an archaeologist and anthropologist from France, who published this in 1964. And he looked at objects not as objet d'art, something that's beautiful, that you just put on display in a museum, but something that's the result of a process. And he looks at all the different phases of that process, the collection of raw materials, the preparation of raw materials, the start of production, the preparation of the area where you work, for instance. Then the production of the object, whether it's a pot or a basket or a wooden bench or what have you. The finishing off. And then nowadays, some people also include use and discard as part of the chaîne opératoire. Not of the production of the thing, but of the life history of the object. Now, if you look in time expansion of most crafts, of most products, then number one, the collecting of raw materials take by far most of the time of the entire production process. And that while if you think about the production, for instance, of making a pot, what do you think of? You think of the potter wheel and how something is shaped on a potter's wheel. If you look at the representation of crafts in the tombs, for instance, in Rechmiré, what you see are parts of the production of the object. What is a relatively tiny part of the entire process, that is what is depicted. Everything else is usually ignored. Even if we try to imagine what making a basket is about, what making a wooden furniture is about, you think about the moment you put things together. And this whole process of assistance takes part in those first phases, collecting the raw material and preparing the raw materials. Maybe preparing the workshop to be ready, to be clean for the production of the object. So this large portion of apprenticeship where you don't even get to make anything corresponds with a very long period of the production process. Then the start of the production itself, the putting together of the object, that is what really comes later. And the finishing off of the object is usually something that mostly the master potters, master basket makers, master furniture makers do. So these phases, for instance, the collection of the materials, in this case palm leaf, are not separated from the production process. usually these things all run together. They're very chaotic. So whenever more clay is necessary or more palm leaf is necessary, people just go out and get it. A lot of these materials come out of the environment. So this is a sort of do-it-yourself package for making a basket. The availability of raw material and how much you have to import or how much you have close by is closely linked to where we can find traces of apprenticeship. So, for instance, with flint working, with flint knapping, before you do that correctly, you can spoil a lot of materials. And if you have to import your flint, for instance, if your obsidian comes from far away, or if you have real high quality material that comes from 200 kilometers away and has to be carried in, you are very careful that you don't have your apprentices play with it. So if you want to find evidence of apprenticeship, it's better to look at the sources of where the flint is found than in the area where most of the flint is produced. And that is basically what you see reflected here. It's an article from the same book that I mentioned from someone who works in Alaska, where she found that the flint sources where you could only come in summer, that are only accessible when there's no snow, there you find a lot of evidence of flint working in a way that just shows that people were just mucking about. They didn't know what they were doing. They were learning. All the flint that was transported out of that area and that has worked in the settlements in the winter was worked by very well-trained flint knappers. So it's clear that that meant that the apprentices, the children, went up with the groups that went to collect flint so that they could have the opportunity to just mock about. Where do we find this transition of knowledge best? Not in a general appearance. Shapes tell you something about traditions. Shapes change. General techniques you find all over the world. For instance, this type of technique, coiled basketry, you literally found everywhere in the world. If you look at Nubian basketry and you look at American Indian basketry, yes, there are differences, of course, there's different materials, but the basic technique is the same. How then can you discern different traditions in these things? It's all in the details. It's all in the details that you learn from your mother, that you learn from your master, the things that are not obvious, the things that you can't get just by imitating, by having a finished product and looking at it and trying to copy it. Those details are, for instance, the center of a basket. We already saw this. Here's the start of a basket. This is what she learns from her teacher. This is how she learns to go about making a basket in Middle Egypt. But if you look at the start of coiled basketry just in Egypt, then there's a huge variation. And not only a variation in the basic way of things that people are doing, but also in the sizes of the coil or the way it goes left or right. There's all these details, the way you lay in new leaflets, the way you finish off things. So those details, the things that you learn from your teacher as an apprentice, that is where you can find those traditions. So just saying that something is a coiled basket has no information whatsoever. You need to go into detail and look at where can I find the hand of the producer. Same is true for matting. What is done at the sides? How are these things finished off? Or this bed matting that's being made. And by the way, here you can really see how you need endurance to do this, to stand bent over a bed, to weave in the matting, kills your back, let me tell you. I tried it for 5 minutes. But you see, he has a very particular way of finishing things off. That is what he learned. So the indications of learning as a sign of apprenticeship is mostly in the details. And we really want to look for these archaeological correlations, because we cannot look, of course, look at what's happening present day in Egypt and beyond, but it's really important to also look at what we can find in the archaeology. If we look at the production process nowadays, we see that there's a difference in task division between apprentices and specialists. We see that there are traditions where there are technological solutions that are typical for a particular workshop or a particular specialist. It's the micro variations in which we can find the communities of practice. Then we're looking at skill and professionalism. Are we dealing with a well-meaning amateur? Are we dealing with a master? Are we dealing with a professional, with a hobbyist? That is something we can tell from the working rhythm and the regularity of the work. And then the context is important, and that's not just the context of where something is made. For instance, how far away did they get the raw materials? But also, as we saw from the examples earlier, the social context of the production. Now, a little bit about working rhythm. This is a type of matting from Middle Egypt. It's called the masbala. I like photographing donkey butts, sorry. It's made on a little ground loom. And when I was analyzing the way this basket maker created basketry or created this matting, I timed this, I created a video, and the timing you see is the frames of the video. And I tried to catch the working rhythm of the basket maker, because if you look at the video, you see very clearly that there's a rhythm in this work. And especially if you fast forward it. If you want to get working rhythm, fast forward the video and you tuck, 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 you get it. Trying to describe that was laborious, and I don't know about you, but it's not very clear. And I realized during this exercise, it was because I tried to translate the tactile into the textual. And the only way I could figure out to do that, apart from saying there is a rhythm, was to try to have this numerical approach as this translation of these different types of knowledge, different types of knowledge transfer. There is, of course, textual knowledge transfer. You write an article, an how-to book, and from that you try to learn something practical. It doesn't work so well. There's visual or audiovisual. You look at the video, or you look at photographs in the book, you look at drawings. A little bit more helpful. Still, it doesn't really get to the essence of it. For that, you have to be in person. And that is the tactile way of transferring knowledge. And that's depicted as well. This is TT109 from Min. And you see how here the prince is corrected by correcting his stance, by making him feel. So if a craftsman say, let me show you, what he actually says is, let me make you feel. Let me make you feel what you're supposed to feel to get it right. In some cases, it's a certain sound. If you do it right, for instance, with flint knapping, if you hit it right, you hear the difference, but most of it, you feel it. And that's a very important part. Now, I told you that there was a correlation between skill and professionalism. I found that skilled workers have a very regular working rhythm. Professional workers are very skilled, but they also need to make speed. So if I look at work from professional basket makers, for instance, then I see there's a regular working rhythm, there's speed, which means there's also regular mistakes. So mistakes do not necessarily mean that a person is not professional. It might just mean that he's in a hurry. What is important, as I already said, were these micro variations, those details that are slightly different. That is where you recognize the hand of the master at the hand of a community of practice. And I want to finish with a beautiful example related to this pedal and anvil technique. So this is a potter in Fayum. This is a potter in India who uses the same technique. There's other areas in Africa that use the pedal and anvil technique. These are the instruments that are used, a kind of mushroom-shaped clay stompers, where you stomp out a ball of clay. And then the pedals help you to make it very tight. This is research from Dr. Sonali Gupta Agarwal, who wrote her thesis on ceramic apprenticeship. And she went around in Egypt and in India with potters who make the same type of ceramics, because she wanted to get her hand on these micro variations. She noticed that when she was walking around in these workshops, whether that was in Egypt, in Fayum, or in India, she could pick up a shirt, there's plenty of broken shirts around, and she would show it to a potter, and she would say, "Who made this pot?" And then the potter would say, "Oh, that wasn't me, that was my brother." So it was from that workshop, that was clear because it was on the ground there, but not from that potter, but from potter B. And both in Egypt and in India, the potters could discern those differences. So Sonali thought, well, if they can recognize that, there is something typical about it. Now, mind you, these were standardized pots. They were standardized cooking pots. They all had the same size. So she did very precise measurements, especially of the rims, because that is where she found most of the variation, micro variations, millimeters. And what she found, she also did this in Balas, what she found was that there are tiny variations in the standard pots from the same workshop from different potters. Being able to do this in present-day pottery workshops where you have someone you can check with whether this is their pot or someone else's, clarifies that you can also do this with ancient potters. She also went to the houses and asked people to bring their pots out, and she would do her measurements, and she could then sort of predict in hindsight that this pot was made by a particular potter from a particular workshop. People thought she was a magician, and she tried to explain that it was micro variations, but they still thought she was a magician. So the nice thing is that we have here a method that is actually replicable in the past. And it's logical because everything that is done in these ancient crafts have to do with the hand and feet of the producers. The size of the opening is a hand span. The size of the rim is exactly 2 fingers, etc. So everything is related to measurements of the body. So that's the body sizes already make a variation. The way that things are measured in a workshop is similar. So there's a good explanation for this, but it's nevertheless really cool that it works. Well, of course, as archaeologists, we are also apprentices. Although I wouldn't call myself a master archaeologist, but I do have pupils, my students in the field with me. And all of this, what we do, is also to help make you feel. It's all about sharing this knowledge that is in our body. It's in the way we trowel. It's the way we do things. And it's something that is sometimes very difficult to explain. But we definitely have a community of practice which differs from site to site. There's way, or even from trench to trench. There's way we do things. And that's the right way of doing it, whether that's really the case or whether it's just a socialization of, if you work on my excavation, this is how you do it. Thank you very much. So all these principles that work in ancient apprenticeship research for our present-day potters, our ancient potters, also work for us archaeologists. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Willeke. That was fascinating. What a tour around all the different techniques and skill levels involved. I'm always fascinated by this concept of time is money and ancient concepts of time and modern concepts of time, and wondering some of these works that just seem to take infinite amounts of time and what the concept was back then, and how there was so much more patience, I suppose, to produce some of these wonderful things. But I don't want to dominate the conversation. We do have lots of questions in the Q&A, and if you'd be willing to stick around for a few minutes, I can read some of those. We have one that says, how should we generate these ethno-archaeological models to understand these ancient practices? Here, let me make that question live. I think people can see that now. Yeah. How should we generate these ethno-archaeological models to understand these ancient practices through their technical elaboration or their function? And given the different groups interacting in Egypt throughout its occupation, how should we relate that artifact production to meanings?
That's a very good set of questions. And it basically would take a chapter of a book to really get deeply into this. But basically, when you do ethnoarchaeological work, you could address 1,000 different questions. And different people, I've actually have had the experience that I was visiting the same workshop with a colleague of mine. And we were both doing a description of what was going on. And we were there at the same time, same place, talking to the same people. And our reports were completely different because we had very different interests. So you start with particular questions, often related to the ancient material that you're studying. And from those questions, they steer your observation, they steer the questions that you pose. They steer you where you go and how often, because if it's something about time expenditure, you might be there for a very, very long time and multiple times. Meaning, of course, is extremely difficult. The best thing you can do is compare at what might be correlates of meaning if things that are important and have meaning are stored in a certain way, or packed in a certain way, or treated in a certain way. Whether this is putting them in a secret place, or contrary, destroying them completely when they have to be thrown out. Those are correlates that you can put in your mind when you think about possible interpretations of the ancient material, but there's of course not a one-to-one correlation. So what ethnoarchaeology helps you with is broaden your mind, help you compare ideas, check different ideas. I mostly try to use it as a way to keep open-minded and not to close off explanations. So definitely never use it as it's here today, so it used to be there in the past. Some things are directly translatable, such as this last example that I gave, that there is micro variation within one workshop. So that is something that you could use, or at least try in different circumstances.
Great. We have another one here. Since making baskets, pots, or tools is learned since childhood, is it feasible to see differences in the archaeological record in the productive processes between what is done to learn and what is done as a toy?
What you see in children, and I have some beautiful footage, but it's in my office and I couldn't get to my office, is that the small children, when they imitate, they don't do the real thing. They do the movements. So you see them pick up a stick that looks like the scraper that their parents use, and they just move it over a pot without any effect. It's the movement that they imitate. Now, in the case of the Dewaywo potters, they can only make these miniature pots. So there is a whole complex between different scales of pottery. Often what you see is that the apprentice potters start with a small pot because that's easier to handle, and then they slowly grow into making bigger and bigger pots. That's true, for instance, for this pedal and anvil technique. You start with the little hollows, with the small globular pots, and you build up knowledge. Once you do that, then you can go bigger and bigger. So there are different skills that are learned at those different steps. The toy-like things are just to understand the basic shape and maybe the ratio between the neck and the body. Once you have that ratio, then you can start to make that bigger, but then you're dealing with bigger problems. How do I make sure it doesn't flop or it doesn't collapse, or whatever problems you have at a larger scale? So it is building up different types of skills over time.
Okay. So speaking of parents and children and pottery and things, if the parents were potters, is the child expected to be a potter too, or can they specialize in other things? So changing of trades, I guess.
Yeah. Often you see that children step in the footsteps of their parents because it is sort of this automatic career path. It's something that everybody can imagine. Nowadays, of course, you do have a lot of challenges there because a lot of those crafts are dying out. A good example is the basket maker I worked with most in Amarna. When I was working there, I would go almost daily into the village to work with one particular basket maker. And he was adamant that his children should go to school and become a civil servant and not follow in his footsteps because he didn't see a future. I was doing work in Kenya, and this was a kafas maker, the guy who makes these crates and furniture. And he actually got very upset every time he saw somebody come past who had either a plastic bag or a plastic crate. And he would cry out, you see? He also uses something else. He also doesn't use my stuff. So a lot of the craftsmen are aware that their craft is dying out. There are, of course, efforts to resuscitate them or keep them alive. So in Nazla, there's a whole movement with people who try to stimulate ecotourism and bring tourists to the site, and also show real appreciation for the art of the craftsman. So in the old days, if you look at the Egyptian wisdom text, you see it there. The ideal was for the sort of the higher ranking professions like scribe, especially if you get to positions of power, that this is not automatical, that you don't automatically follow your father's footstep. It is based on merit in theory. The fact that this is so focused on in those wisdom texts means that it probably was quite automatical, and that they needed to stress that it was merit-based and not because you were the son of. So I think in the past, in many societies, it was a matter of going in the footsteps of your parents. If you look, for instance, in the village near Tel El Amarna, there you see that some women make baskets, others do not. And this one girl, whose hands I've shown, decided that even though her mother didn't make baskets, she wanted to learn this. And that had to do with the tourist trade. At that time, there were still tourists going to Middle Egypt. And if you've been there, you've seen the children sort of flock around the ferry when you come in and try to sell these little baskets. At that stage, we saw actually a change in the size of the baskets, because the bread baskets, the big white baskets that I showed a photo of, they didn't fit a Samsonite suitcase. So the basket makers started to make those big baskets, but just to the size that they would fit a Samsonite or a hard shell suitcase. So that's one adaptation of
Right.
craft.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned women in that scenario. Here's a good question about women in literacy. I've heard that literacy in ancient Egypt also extended to women. For instance, a scene from Queen Nefertari's tomb where she's represented opposite the god Thoth with a palette apparently means that she could read and write. How common was this, and how much do we know about female scribal apprenticeship?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
We know that, for instance, in Deir el-Medina, the literacy rate was higher than in most parts of Egypt. And of course, Queen Nefertari was the top of the top. So she had religious functions as well. And the scribal tradition was closely linked to religion and religious texts. How literate women were in Deir el-Medina, we don't really know. We do know that the laundry lists were symbols. So if you wanted to give your laundry, you had a little drawing of the type of garment, were the fringes on this side or fringes on this side. And then you just put dots. I have 3 of these and 4 of these. So that makes you think that the women who were giving the laundry or the laundrymen who were receiving the laundry were not literate. We do know, and there's an interesting lecture by Ann Austin coming up at RC Orange County, I think on Saturday, that there were a lot of tattooed women, and I'm not going to give away her punchline, but these were also important, well-educated women. They mostly had figurative tattoos, although there were hieroglyphs as well. Now, of course, the person who has the tattoo didn't necessarily make the tattoo, but it's thinkable that most of the high elite women had some sort of literacy. The majority of Egyptian population, men and women, did not. But I wouldn't dare to give a percentage. Peter,
no,
yes?
No, it's a terrifying number to try to give, whether it's 0.2% or 0.5% or 1% sounds pretty high. But along those lines, we have a gender distinction question as well. So how much gender distinction can be observed in the apprenticeship process with different crafts versus the same crafts? For example, pottery decoration by women versus by men. Can we tell that? Do we have enough data?
No, that's the problem. We don't have the data. So what we can do is look at the imagery in tombs, but not all crafts are depicted there. For instance, there's no basket makers. We can, of course,
drives you crazy, I'm sure.
It saves a lot of time. I don't have to study those. No, actually, I've been looking, but there's mat makers, but not basket makers. The mat makers are men. And mat makers, even though I showed you a picture of a woman making a mat makers in Egypt are usually men as well. And this was a woman because she was a widow, and she took over the craft of her of her husband, her deceased husband. We can, of course, look at what the division of labor is nowadays, but again, we can't just stick that on the past. We can see where we find traces. Is it something that requires a specialized workshop? And that's one of the things I always pay a lot of attention to when I look around in present-day Egypt or wherever I'm working. How much space is needed? And is this specialized space, or is this space that can be used in multiple ways? A pottery workshop, you're pretty much stuck with doing that. You need a kiln, you need a pottery wheel, that you need these hollows in the ground. So there's a lot of structural facilities that you need for that. A mat weaving loom takes up a lot of space. And even though you can just remove it when you're not weaving, it's still something for which you have at least that space available while you're creating the mat. Weaving, we know that in Amarna, the workman's village, there's a lot of evidence for weaving and spinning. Now, that is something that you can set up, do part-time, take up and do whenever you have a moment. So this difference between, can you do something part-time, can you put it away without the thing unraveling, are important indications, at least for full-time work, part-time work. And then you can surmise that part-time work is done maybe more by women, unless it is a division between harvest time, non-harvest time. I'm sure that in harvest time, everybody was in the field. So some of these things may be flexible. Some of these things may be socially fixed. We won't be easily able to tell that. We can make arguments, and as long as we're extremely explicit about those arguments, for instance, say, this is something you can put down at any time, that could be an argument for suggesting that it might be women's work. The funny thing is that in present day society, those distinctions are very sharp. I was working in Egyptian Nubia, and one man insisted on demonstrating all the basketry techniques, and the women were sort of rolling their eyes. And because he was not a basket maker, he knew how to do this, but it really wasn't his profession. And he was doing it wrong. So I was looking at him and I thought, what are you doing? And then I looked up and I saw all these women go like,
wow. So he insisted on doing the demo. But this is something we worry about with the Giza modeling that we do a lot of the time in temple rooms and things, is what is the use of that space? And if we put some equipment and avatars in there, are we misleading people, insinuating that there is only one function for that room when there could be many functions? So that's a really important point to keep in mind.
But that's also the great thing about your Giza model, because you can actually force the discussion by putting different things in that room. Put a bunch of priestesses in there, see what it does. If
a question of bandwidth.
Well, yeah, of course.
We have another question. Given that some apprenticeships, ancient and modern alike, begin at fairly young ages, does any archaeological evidence invite interpretations of play practices used consciously as parts of initiating or instructing young or future pupils?
I haven't really found in archaeology clear evidence for this. Of course, if you think of miniature pots and miniature tools and miniature baskets, which are very badly made, that are used for temple deposits, for instance, how should we think of that? Should we only think of that as these are miniatures for a temple deposit and they're highly religious and highly meaningful? What happens if we start to think of this just as a mental exercise, that these were the products of young apprentices that were running around? I'm not saying they are, because I simply don't know, but they're definitely not very well made. And of course, what we see at the Duayo is that these little pots are being made, these miniature pots. I don't know what they were used for, but we have lots of examples of small plates, for instance, in Abydos. So maybe that was the task for apprentices to make loads of these easy plates.
Right. We have time for just a couple more, I think. Here's an interesting one. Have you been able to see the use of the body as a measuring tool in ancient pottery as well? For example, measuring finger or handprints found on pottery and comparing it to rim thicknesses and sizes.
That is everywhere, but you need to start looking at it and just trying it. I mean, the whole Egyptian measuring system is a body system. So when you look at ceramics, just see what the possible standards are there. In basketry, it's very strong. Nowadays, if you see, for instance, these big bread baskets, they are 3 shibber. A shibber is 1 handspan. So you go 1, 2, 3, and then you know that you're at the end of your basket, you're done. The carrying baskets, which are not pharaonic, they come in the Roman period, but these are made of a long plait that is sewn in a spiral. It's all the baskets that you see on the market. They are made by measuring the length of the plait. And you have standard sizes. You can have, and that's a body span from one hand to one hand, 2 arm lengths across the body. So you can have one for which the plait was 3 times this, 6 times this, 9 times this, and the resulting basket is different sizes. So it's not the size of the basket that's measured, it's the size of the plait that's measured. So there's different ways to get at these measurements, but they all have something to do with the body.
Okay. And here's one a little dubious about 7 years. Isn't 7 years too long a time to learn any of this skill? Or is there a papyrus or any inscription that clarifies that?
Well, 7 years is what I've seen nowadays. And 7 years is what you take if you want to enculturate. So it's not so much about learning how to do something. It's really how to become part of the community at a certain level. So it's proving your mettle. And of course, we can't say that there was a 7-year apprenticeship in Egypt. And also nowadays, it depends on how skilled you are, or I shouldn't say how skilled, how talented you are. So some people learn much faster than others. But the idea that you could learn something in half a year is preposterous, because it's not just about learning to do something. It's about paying service to the community. You need someone to drag all the fuel. You need someone to bring in the clay. And the youngest person in the crew is doing that. So it also will depend. If they're short in potters, that might go faster. But it's really this whole procedure of paying respect to the community, becoming part of the community, being born into the community, and then being a full part of the community. It's a growing up, presumably with transitions, either as ceremony or as just a next stage. In present-day societies, these are very important moments when you go from one stage to the next stage.
Fantastic. So much to learn about the whole process. Are the books by the Jansons, Getting Old in Ancient Egypt and Growing Up in Ancient Egypt, do they touch on apprenticeships in these ways, or do you find that it's time to reinvestigate these issues?
They do touch upon some of it, and some of the things I showed today, the line drawings, are actually from their books. But I do think it merits reinvestigation and much more focus on the archaeology rather than just text and images, because text and images tell us only so much, and right. They tell us very specific things. So a lot of these things you can only see once you start looking for them. And there, looking at present day examples is very helpful, because then you know better what to look for. And being really keenly aware of that there's both continuity and differences and changes, and how that plays out in the material culture is extremely important.
Fascinating.
So yeah, I think we should redo those books, although I love them, but let's redo them.
Well, you've set us on the right path in that case. So I think we have hit our time limit here. I want to thank you, Willeke, for a fantastic lecture, and also great questions from our audience. So really gave me lots to think about here. And I think in a successful format like this, we will have additional lectures, and we hope to bring back our audience many, many times as this semester and next semester goes on. So thank you once again for taking time from your schedule in LA to join us. And thanks to all of our audience and to our HMSC hosts, and we will see you here again. Thanks, Willeke.
Thanks.